When historians tell the story of 1917 Halifax, they usually concentrate on the destruction that happened above ground. The massive blast, the 2,000 deaths, 9,000 injuries, and whole neighborhoods turned into splinters and ash. However, the true story, one that barely made it into the papers and still lies hidden in maritime archives today, actually started underneath the harbor. It all began as a straightforward rescue mission, where engineers were told to remove debris from the decimated north end, shore up what was left of the waterfront, and figure out if the destroyed ground could handle reconstruction. The objective was purely practical: clear the wreckage, evaluate structural damage, and get ready for rebuilding. Yet the instant workers started digging through the blast area, something surprising occurred as they penetrated layers that hadn't seen daylight in generations. Under the harbor district, going deeper than any known foundation had ever reached, the teams discovered chambers and corridors that didn't align with colonial building records. Their positioning was strange, their depth was extraordinary, and the stonework bore no resemblance to anything found in British North America's architectural catalogues, or even to standard maritime construction as we typically understand it. This discovery never appeared in official relief documentation and didn't show up in newspapers chronicling Halifax's recovery. But within that year's internal records, one particular phrase keeps showing up repeatedly: unforeseen infrastructure, unexpected depth, origin unclear. The official version would eventually reduce all this to nothing more than old storage cellars, forgotten smuggling routes, or just misidentified remnants from colonial times. Nothing unusual and nothing worth mentioning. However, the recovery photos from that period, the ones developed in temporary darkrooms while Halifax was rebuilding, tell a completely different story as they show workers standing next to stone corridors carved with precision far beyond what any colonial-era tools should have been capable of producing. Tunnel sections fitted so perfectly together that even in the grainy 1917 photography you can't see any construction seams. Waterway systems cut into bedrock that don't match any recorded maritime infrastructure, but instead suggest something older, more advanced, and more intentional. The deeper they excavated, the less the layers resembled colonial history as we know it, and the more they looked like infrastructure that had been actively used, then abandoned and deliberately hidden. Initially, the recovery teams attempted to explain everything in the simplest terms possible: abandoned cellars, forgotten storage tunnels, natural limestone caves formed by water erosion. But as records piled up and more passages came to light, the inconsistencies grew exponentially. Why did certain underground structures have load-bearing capabilities that vastly exceeded anything built above them? Why were specific stone blocks cut in nearly identical dimensions, as if factory-made instead of hand-carved? Why did some hallways extend into blackness well past the edges of any documented settlement? And the question that bothered even the most seasoned engineers was this: why were these structures so massive? Halifax in 1917 was just a modest port town, yet the underground network beneath portions of the harbor district seemed designed for something far bigger than simple warehouses and merchant facilities. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the scope and craftsmanship didn't match up with any colonial or pre-colonial documentation. And while nobody was throwing around terms like lost civilizations, they were coming to terms with something just as unsettling. Someone had built beneath this land long ago, not just simple storage areas or smuggling paths, but actual infrastructure. As documentation accumulated, so did an eerie silence because reports got shorter. Descriptions turned vague. Photographs stopped capturing the full scope of what they'd found. And then the dig sites were partially resealed in late 1918, backfilled wherever reconstruction required it. And most of what had been exposed went back into darkness. Only bits and pieces remain today, some documentation, a handful of photographs, and the hushed testimonies of archivists who reviewed the files before certain ones disappeared. But even from what survived, you can see a pattern emerging. Passages too consistent for any known colonial settlement, stonework too exact for the accepted historical timeline, building techniques that seem passed down through generations, foundations that appear to belong to an entirely different construction period. When the recovery crews pushed past the first recognizable layers beneath Halifax's north end, their expectations were simple enough. They figured they'd find natural bedrock, maybe some abandoned colonial construction, and scattered debris from early settlers. Nothing weird and nothing remarkable. But within just a few weeks, that assumption completely fell apart, because instead of finding a logical sequence of geological and historical layers, the crews uncovered a series of architectural levels that didn't behave the way layers in a normal coastal town are supposed to behave. The first oddity was directional alignment, because every layer, colonial, pre-colonial, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same directional orientation, the same angles, the same geometric grid. Different time periods shouldn't show that kind of consistency, since different builders with different goals separated by decades or even centuries don't build in perfect alignment with structures erected generations before them. Yet beneath Halifax's waterfront, they did exactly that. Rooms from one era were positioned directly above rooms from another. Passages lined up with passages buried meters below them. Structural walls kept the same trajectory even when separated by an unknown number of decades, almost as if every group that ever built on this site was following some original blueprint that no longer exists in any historical archive. As workers dug even deeper, the layers became stranger still, because below the expected bedrock and colonial foundations, they began finding stonework that looked nothing like standard construction. Much larger blocks, far tighter joints, arrangements that seemed too geometrically perfect for anything in Halifax's documented timeline. Some chambers seemed almost excessive, with vaulted ceilings showing flawless curves, executed with a level of precision that didn't match the crude tools colonial builders supposedly had available. Then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conventional members of the engineering review team. Advanced water management infrastructure, including channel systems with precision grading, drainage mechanisms built to handle pressure, reservoir chambers with flow regulation features, yet there's no historical record of Halifax ever having such sophisticated hydraulic engineering during the colonial period. No maps showing complex water systems beneath these specific locations. Nothing explaining why major sections of the deepest infrastructure seem built for water management that goes way beyond basic drainage or storage. Recovery photographs taken in 1917 and 1918 prove this beyond doubt, showing workers positioned next to channels carved so precisely that the men look primitive by comparison, stone waterways cut so accurately that even modern civil engineers study the archived photos in disbelief, gradients and connections that resemble contemporary infrastructure far more than anything colonial Halifax is credited with building. But the most disturbing part wasn't what showed up in the photographs. It was what didn't show up in official records, because the authorized reports written in the years after the recovery barely mention these features. Some diagrams leave out the deepest passages entirely. Certain infrastructure layers get lumped together under vague terms like earlier foundations or natural formations, even though the photos clearly show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to ignore, because if these lower levels really belonged to recognized historical periods, why weren't they documented in detail? Why weren't the remarkable construction techniques thoroughly recorded? Why were the photographs scattered across maritime archives instead of being compiled into one federal record? Even certain stone surfaces raised concerns with edges too sharp, channels too uniform, marks that looked less like hand-cutting and more like precision manufacturing, work that according to the conventional timeline shouldn't have existed when those passages were supposedly built. What the recovery crews found were structures that didn't match British colonial construction, didn't match French settlement patterns, and didn't even match each other in traditional terms, but instead formed a strange engineering language that seemed to come from multiple time periods, yet somehow stayed unified, oriented, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves, because these weren't crude storage cellars or cramped cave systems. They were geometrically exact spaces, rooms built with perfect proportions, arches that maintained their curves flawlessly, and stone vaults laid out with such consistency it was almost like seeing fragments of some master plan that doesn't exist in any archive anymore. Some chambers were completely sealed, filled with blast debris so compressed that workers thought they'd hit natural bedrock. But once broken through, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls of assembled stone and building patterns that raised more questions than they answered. Then came the feature that still baffles researchers today: the massive circular stone structures that were later labeled as old cisterns or storage wells, except nothing about them fits typical colonial engineering or basic water storage. These were too symmetrical, too deep, and too perfectly round, as if they'd been carved with tools capable of maintaining absolute curvature. Some structures wide enough to hold several men inside, while others had internal features suggesting mechanical functions. Workers from 1917 described them in private letters as engineered containers, not wells, but constructions serving some specific purpose, though nobody could say what that purpose might have been. Another strange detail emerged in how certain support systems were built, because these weren't just simple colonial foundations. Many were designed with load-bearing strength that made no architectural sense for the humble buildings that had stood above them, raising an uncomfortable possibility that the waterfront structures might not simply rest on natural bedrock, but might actually rest on something much larger, an infrastructure whose true scale was never documented, never acknowledged, and never explained in Halifax's authorized history. The farther workers dug, the stranger things got as stone blocks appeared, with perfectly straight edges. Some surfaces were smooth, almost polished, while others showed precision-carved grooves so clean that modern stonemasons still argue about what tools could have made them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was metal embedded within ancient stonework, some pieces appearing melted, oxidized in ways that indicated extreme heat. Yet they were found in layers supposedly predating any metalworking sophisticated enough to produce such effects. The official explanation offered later was ship debris from the explosion or colonial metal fixtures. But that doesn't explain why the metal appears inside the stones in patterns that aren't randomly distributed, but instead placed deliberately as if the stone had been formed around it. That kind of result requires temperatures far exceeding typical blacksmith work, far exceeding colonial metalworking, and far exceeding anything documented in maritime records. Shortly after these findings, something strange began happening as chambers got resealed. Passages were filled back in. Deep sections of the sites were cut off from further excavation. Some of this was officially listed as structural safety issues needed to stabilize the damaged waterfront. But the decisions about which chambers to reseal first and which sections to leave open raised quiet doubts among witnesses because the passages closed immediately were consistently the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The perfectly carved structures, the advanced water management systems, The unusual metal embeddings, the engineered passages that seemed to extend far beyond the excavation zone. These passages were perhaps the most mysterious discovery of all, since they weren't random tunnels, but parts of a deliberate system, a network of corridors that seemed less like storage and more like infrastructure. Oriented, planned, organized, as though they once linked to a far larger underground network stretching beneath the harbor, long before any settlement we know about ever existed on the surface. Yet almost as fast as they were uncovered, many were sealed again, with their entrances blocked, their purpose left unexplored, and their existence quietly removed from later reconstruction maps. When you look at the final months of the 1917 to 1918 recovery efforts, something becomes impossible to ignore. The operations didn't end. They were stopped, not completed, not finished, but deliberately halted. The farther recovery crews went, the more their documentation changed character, as early reports were confident and almost routine. But toward the end, the language turns cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly took control of what could be written down. This is where the real mystery begins, because the final chambers they reached beneath Halifax's waterfront weren't ordinary. They weren't geological. They weren't colonial leftovers. They weren't even identifiable. They were something completely different. Multiple testimonies, the few that survived, described stonework that suddenly shifted from recognizable to incomprehensible, with walls fitted so tightly you couldn't slide a knife blade between them, curved passages built with accuracy that colonial Halifax was never supposed to possess, platforms engineered for purposes far beyond anything documented above ground, and corridors extending past the dig zone, disappearing into darkness beneath the rebuilt city. But here's the part that always gets hidden. The most sophisticated chambers were the ones buried first, as workers described refilling entire passages, blocking entrances, packing dirt into spaces that had just been opened. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official justification being geological instability, safety concerns, and reconstruction needs. But if it was really just about safety, why were the oldest, most pristine, most structurally sound chambers the ones sealed first, while the most unstable, blast-damaged areas stayed open for documentation? It doesn't make sense, unless those deeper levels posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, but a historical one. Because if the foundations below Halifax's waterfront really showed construction methods beyond colonial capability, and if some of those chambers didn't correspond to any known settlement at all, then the entire accepted story of maritime Canadian history begins to fall apart. Think about what it would mean if a modern harbor city was built on top of something far more ancient, something enormous, something manufactured, something we didn't make. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't natural formations, but intentional efforts by later peoples to hide or reuse what came before. And maybe that's why the 1917 discoveries were quietly buried again. Not to protect the sites, but to protect the story. The surviving photographs tell their own tale, showing workers standing next to passages that look almost modern, waterway systems too precise for their supposed age, infrastructure too advanced for colonial engineering. These aren't the kinds of findings historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to mention at all. And that leads us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the earliest construction, the most advanced infrastructure sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear as the flawless stonework was buried, the strange circular structures were buried, the unexplainable passages were buried, the sophisticated water systems were buried, the embedded metal pieces were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished. Almost as if the recovery had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than British settlement, older than French colonization, older than the story we were given. For one brief moment in 1917, the explosion tore the ground open enough to expose it. But instead of investigating it, they closed it back up, sealed it, backfilled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Halifax sits on top of structures built by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the real question isn't what was found in 1917, but what else lies beneath the harbor cities of the world. What other ports? What other waterfronts? What other coastal settlements were quietly reburied long before cameras even existed? The 1917 Halifax excavation wasn't just a recovery operation. It was a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never supposed to see. Where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments which city or country you are from. We would love to know who is watching with us. Share your thoughts, observations, or questions. Every comment is important. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. Together, we are creating a community of curious explorers.